You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. When you think about small game in Mississippi, you think about squirrels, rabbits, but also quail. We're going to learn about quail populations and quail hunting in the state of Mississippi today with MDWFP Small Game Coordinator, Rick Hamrick.
Mississippi Outdoors is sponsored by Entergy Mississippi. Entergy is building a stronger and cleaner grid to power a brighter future and protect our great outdoors for generations to come.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. And today, Small Game Coordinator at MDWFP, Rick Hamrick. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be here.
Yeah, and so small game, it sounds like a big, broad umbrella there. Like I said, there's a lot of things that fall under that small game name, don't they?
Well, it's a few things anyway. We've got quail, rabbits, and squirrel within our small game program. It used to include doves, but doves got moved to the migratory bird program, and so now we're more or less a three species program. We do have bullfrogs in there as well, but okay. I will profess not to be a bullfrog expert. But
well, I want to hear about that.
Yeah, some bullfrog talk at some point. That might be your title when it's all said and done, too. But for you, Rick, what was sort of the career path that led you into this and coordinating the small game program here?
Oh, well, as far as small game goes, it's something that was kind of, I guess, my biggest interest growing up as far as something to hunt. Of course, I went through a phase where deer was kind of a big thing for me as well, like a lot of youngsters are when they're kind of getting to where they can deer hunt. But squirrel hunting is where I first started out, but it really was one of the things I still really enjoyed kind of all throughout my life. I still really enjoy, just kind of the basics of just going squirrel hunting, stalk hunting squirrels kind of in the fall of the year, especially. Mm-hmm. I don't get out and do it as much as I used to, but I really enjoyed that. But what kind of got me on quail also, just recently got a bird dog a couple of years ago. And so kind of have finally gotten into that part of it as well. And so my father was a wildlife biologist, and so that's kind of what got me into the career path. It's just something I grew up around. And so that sort of led me into the career. Went to school, got a bachelor's degree in wildlife fishery science, Mississippi State. Worked on some projects there for graduate students while I was going through. Worked on a few quail projects, and so I wound up doing my master's degree at University of Georgia on quail, doing research there. And so that kind of really, I guess, spurred me on as far as kind of on the quail side of things, being really interested in that. Again, just kind of being on the science side for a good while, and then gotten finally a little bit more into the hunting side of it here in the more recent years. But sort of that's kind of my career path there, and sort of where I came from.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Newton, Mississippi.
All right.
Kind of east central part of the state between Meridian and Jackson. So relatively small town. I just say I'm from Newton, even though I'm from, probably like 10, 15 miles out of town. Grew up in the country, but that was our mailing address was Newton. So I just say I'm from Newton, Mississippi. So
what quail hunting opportunities did you have, or did you have any growing up?
Yeah, as a kid. So I grew up in the early 80s, it was kind of when I was really starting to kind of become aware as an outdoorsman kind of person, I guess. I do remember hearing quail calling around at that time. I do remember, running through some agricultural fields, different things around near home there. Mm-hmm. Had a little curly-haired dog that was a mix. I think he was a cockapoo, but a loyal little dog. But we were buddies there, and so we'd run around these fields. And I remember just being covered in beggar lice, and the dog just having cockleburs all in his ears and different things. And so those were still some birds kind of hanging around there. My older brother picked up a few birds here and there, just kind of walking along some of the silage fields and stuff there that in the area. We still had a few dairies down in that area at that time in the 80s. And so there was still a little bit of land use that was kind of conducive to that. And so and then I just, it wasn't enough so much that there were still people really hunting. And so I missed that part of it. My grandfather, one of my great grandfathers, had dogs. I see the old pictures, and they would bird hunt, and of course all the they had both passed on by the time I came along. But remember, other relatives talking about, they would take the dog and just run across 4 or 5 different properties. Everybody knew each other and that kind of thing. And so, like a lot of us, I've kind of had that family background there and the stories and that kind of thing. But by the time I came along, there was, it was kind of fading out just as far as the numbers of birds, at least in that part of the state, and then just not that many people still hunting and having dogs and that kind of thing. So I kind of missed that end of the sort of heyday of it, I guess you could say.
Well, and I think I'm a little older than you, but still similar thing where I would hear stories of, the quail hunting and the opportunities that there used to be versus how, fewer there were as we started coming on up and into now. So go into that a little bit for someone listening who might not be as familiar with the history of why the numbers of quail, numbers of birds did decrease over time here.
Yeah, and so it's it wasn't quite as drastic, everywhere at the same time. And so again, I mentioned the east central part of the state, kind of where I was, just the sort of the land use change. By that time, there were still people that were hunting and having some decent hunts on up into the 90s, when I was in high school and starting college. And so really, again, that was a lot of land use kind of things. So when Europeans first settled the country there, there was a big agricultural boom. And so, there's a lot of clearing of forests and everybody was kind of scratching out a living on the land. And so, over time, that kind of grew. A lot of the forest was cleared for agriculture. And so a lot of that early agriculture actually inflated quail numbers, from what they were historically.
Okay.
And so it actually, we actually increased the ranges in some areas and in different parts of the country. And so, so that's really what kind of started the big quail boom. It kind of goes back to, maybe the late 1800s, somewhere in there, that that it really kind of maybe caught on more as a sort of something you did kind of as a big sport with the dogs and everything like that. I mean, it goes further back than that, but maybe it's just kind of where it really started hitting its height, where it was kind of a big thing. And so oddly enough, people have been lamenting the quail decline since the early 1900s. If you can believe that.
Really, I see.
Yeah, and so this really goes back a long ways, and so kind of what's happened. Again, we had that big change in land use. It was just a lot of things happened there, kind of in those early days. People would farm a little piece for a while, and then they may, kind of use the ground up. They would maybe move over and farm another place. And so you just kind of created this little patchwork, all these fields and small areas around. You would have areas that were just kind of left to grow back up. Those just kind of created perfect areas for quail for a long time. And so, and that kind of continued on through, even until about World War II. People were still using draft animals and, mules to plow fields down here. My picture of my grandfather, that was still plowing with a mule.
Yeah.
It hadn't been that long ago, that we were still using
less than 100 years ago
animals. Yeah.
40s, late 40s.
Yeah. Well, early 40s. Yeah. In that area. And so, about the time we kind of got past World War II, then, that's when machinery really kind of started coming on and farming a lot more. And so, a lot of that started out kind of, what we might use in our food plots, most of us, just kind of a little small tractor. And that was kind of the beginning of agricultural mechanization there. And so
a lot of mules got put out of business.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you saw that transition there, and it's just been steadily building up to where we are today, where we've got the huge machinery, farming is a business. And so, it's not trying to paint anybody as the bad guy or anything, but the way we're making a living off the land is just realizing, agriculture has changed significantly. Forestry has changed significantly, just things like we don't use that much paper anymore, and so that's changed the way we grow and cut forest and things. And so it's just a lot of these little kind of subtle land use things over 100 or so years have just kind of led us to where we are today. And so kind of one of maybe the last little booms we had was kind of when Conservation Reserve Program was kind of really going in the mid 80s to kind of maybe about till 2000, somewhere in that area. You still had some fields kind of coming out of agriculture and going into some of these conservation programs. And so Mississippi, we planted a lot of trees in those programs. And so, for about 4 or 5 years, we saw a pretty good quail response to that because
like early 2000s, you say?
Yeah, and prior,
Okay.
kind of through the 90s up until the early 2000s.
Okay.
You saw some places, different parts of the state that still had some little kind of remnant decent areas for quail hunting there. And, you still hear some of the folks talking about the stories, that was maybe some of their last good hunts were kind of during some of that period. And so, so you had just kind of this flush of just sort of grassy, weedy type areas growing up, and then a lot of those planted forest areas that are now mature forest, pretty much. And so kind of the ground cover that was conducive to quail habitat has just kind of been replaced. And so a lot of times now we've got sort of these really dense forests in a lot of areas. They're not managed with fire in a lot of cases. And so, those changes have led to areas that are less suitable for quail. They just don't quite have a lot of the things they need to make a living.
Okay.
For a quail to be a quail.
It's primarily habitat related. Well, it is habitat related is what you're
primarily.
saying. So what is prime habitat and for a quail from shelter to food to everything? What's prime habitat?
Yeah. So it can vary a little bit through the year, but generally, a quail doesn't necessarily have to have that large of an area to make a living. Their ranges can vary from a few acres to maybe 100 or so acres, just depending if they've got everything they need in a relatively small area. They pretty much can hang out in that area, and that's, you kind of hear people talking about, finding that covey in the same places over and over again. And so that's kind of, they tend to be kind of tied to a relatively localized area. Again, they're not like a songbird, like a cardinal that picks up and flies a long distance. They're going to be pretty well kind of in a somewhat confined area there. So, they don't fly a lot unless they absolutely have to. They spend most of their time on the ground. They're going to walk rather than, fly unless they have to. And so that's just kind of their strategy. But as far as what's kind of really good habitat, you might just describe again, you can find quail in some places where sometimes it just leaves you scratching your head like, what in the world are you doing here? But kind of typically what's the, I guess, kind of classic quail cover, we think about just something like broom sedge, maybe, that everybody's familiar with, that kind of brown looking upright grass that you might see a big sea of out in a field or something there that's just kind of left to grow. And so that's kind of one of the areas where they're going to sort of nest and roost, is kind of in those upright native type grasses like that kind of grow in those bunches. And so there's not a lot of food value there, but again, that's a cover source that's useful for them at certain times of year. And now when their little ones hatch out, they're about the size of bumblebees. And so, if you shrink yourself down to that level, something that's the size of a bumblebee, you need some pretty specific stuff there to be able to live. And so they're going to require pretty open conditions at ground level.
Okay.
And so, and there's certain management practices we recommend to people that are managing habitat to kind of produce those conditions, but they're also going to need to be covered. Again, everything in the world is trying to eat quail. So
I was going to ask you that too. I mean, some of it pretty obvious, but you said they're going to spend most of their time on the ground. So that really opens them up from a predator standpoint.
Yeah,
right?
It really does. I mean, it's like I said, there's just pretty much everything out there just based on their size. That's kind of their lot in life, Yeah. So yeah, I mean, everything from snakes to, predatory birds, a lot of the mammalian predators, pretty much anything.
Coyotes.
Well, coyotes get a bad rap, but they're probably really not that detrimental to the quail. Now, certainly they will eat a quail if they run across it, but coyotes' diet is extremely varied, and so they're going to eat a lot of other things as well. And so they will also harass and potentially kill raccoons. They eat snakes in some cases. And so you might could argue in some cases coyotes are net neutral to maybe a positive in some ways for quail. For some other species, they're probably a more effective predator, but coyote is probably not as much on quail. It's going to be more of your sort of mid-size mammals, raccoons, and those kind of mammals there that are going to be more of your nest predators and a little harder on quail.
Well, Chip, that might be your viral title right there. Coyotes get a bad rap.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
From a quail standpoint.
From a quail. Subtitle, from a quail standpoint. So, Rick, you talk about habitat. I'm wondering, too, about, geographically in the state of Mississippi. We have so much diversity. When you look at Delta versus really anywhere else, or you look at Northeast Mississippi versus, Pine Belt versus coast, is there a certain part of the state of Mississippi that now, 2025, is a little, more conducive to quail population and has more quail?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I will, I guess, say yes in some ways. So we've always kind of looked at like the Northeast part of the state as being a little more land use friendly, just because the way it's broken up with you got a little more hilly ground kind of in there. And so you still have some areas that have maybe a little smaller agriculture, just based on kind of the slope of the land in some of those places. You still have some of the big bottoms that are farmed, but so some of those, just kind of the way they're arranged with the land use, maybe has been a little more favorable. Again, probably not anybody that lives in those areas is going to say they're satisfied with the bird numbers if they're trying to hunt quail, but just the way the land is arranged there, just kind of again, kind of smaller fields sort of mixed around with the woods, maybe is maybe the Northeast part just a little bit better in arrangement wise. The Delta is interesting because we get some really good quail responses when you put habitat on the ground in the Delta. And so people that are maybe familiar with the Wetland Reserve Program, where they plant the hardwood trees, again, for about 10 years, when those trees are first planted, you get just the flush of grass and growth that comes up, and it's just ideal quail habitat for a few years, until those trees kind of grow up, shaded out. The grass kind of goes away, and then you're just kind of left with leaves on the ground. We see some really good responses sometimes when you put a big chunk of ground and just kind of let it grow up in the Delta. And it's interesting. One of the thoughts is maybe that it's a little different predator context, which is kind of an interesting theory, that just because it is such a wide open landscape in a lot of cases, it's a long way from one tree line to another in a lot of places. And so there's fewer hawk perches, there's fewer places for raccoons to kind of hang out. Yeah, that's, I don't know that that's been proven, but that's kind of one of the theories, that it's a very different predator context.
This kind of makes me think of the guest we had on talking about the hunting bear and panther in the Old South.
I was going to say the same thing. We talked to a gentleman that wrote a book, and he was kind of chronicling the history of bird dog trials.
And they had the big cane breaks in the Delta.
Yeah,
Is that something that quail would have liked?
I think they probably would have used that for just kind of areas to hit for like kind of thicket cover. Yeah. That's not going to satisfy necessarily all their year-long needs, but I could see them ducking into those. Yeah. Just for kind of escape kind of areas and places just to kind of hang out. Yeah.
Sure. Not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, I was up in Marshall, DeSoto County, that area, and I had to drive up into that southernmost part of Tennessee, and right over there, close to, I think it's called LaGrange, Tennessee, little bitty small, place there, where just outside of there, they had the, I think it's the Bird Dog Hall of Fame, they called it, right up in that particular area. So, and then Pontotoc, in that book, Pontotoc, over 100 years ago, it was the area where they were having some big bird dog trials and stuff because of quail population. So you're talking about Northeast Mississippi and that Tupelo area. And Pontotoc's between Tupelo and Oxford, for those that don't know. But it makes me think, as you describe that part of the state, I guess just a variety of places. And I know you were talking about the Delta. Back to that, the Delta. So you're saying that there's been some instances where, you would produce the habitat and the quail would just naturally occur?
Yeah, I mean, we see that in a lot of places, but it's really interesting how the Delta, it seems to they just really seem to boom a lot of times when you put habitat on the ground there. And a lot of times it does seem to be in bigger chunks. You will have like these hardwood plantings, a lot of times they'll do them over maybe hundreds or thousands of acres in some areas, just depending on the size of the place that they may be putting back. But yeah, I mean, it's, I guess they just kind of hang out on some of the ditch edges and things like that, even though they're just kind of little small cover areas, there's a little remnant population that hangs out there. And when you put a big chunk of habitat down, they really seem to respond to it.
They find it.
Yeah. And like even some of the folks that do like waterfowl management, when they draw their kind of flooded areas down for the summer to work them up, and a lot of times you'll get a big flush of vegetation growth there, and you'll see quail out in those areas, especially raising broods again, because it is kind of that new growth. It has a fairly clean ground, and those little bumblebees can roll around in there and pick up bugs real easy. And, and so it's interesting. The Delta, like I say, it's, and it's one of the areas, historically, back when it was all large scale bottom and hardwood forests, that we would not have had quail really in any in any significant numbers. And so again, agricultural clearing really kind of opened that area up to quail habitat. And then of course you mentioned the piney woods. We do still have some pockets around there too that have some bird numbers, just based on there's a little bit more of a fire culture that's kind of persisted in the southern part of the state. Maybe a little more so than some of the others. And so that has kind of led to a little bit more favorable habitat conditions in some places, just because people have still used fire to manage their woods. And so kind of an interesting dynamic on just sort of the different land use again, but it all kind of comes back to habitat really in the end, and kind of what's favorable. And, like I say, we've just kind of gone from almost, at least half or more of the state being favorable quail habitat, just based on the way people use land, to now we're down to just kind of these little pockets kind of dotted around. And so, without getting too complicated though, that affects just how populations operate too. And so part of the reason we don't get the bigger response maybe sometimes is just because our populations are a little more isolated. And so there's more hostile territory in between these different populations and all. But clearcuts are a good example of just kind of how they seem to spring up out of nowhere. It's just, we had it on our family land a few years ago. There's very few birds. You cut timber, and again, that you get that big flush of grassy growth and stuff, and it's basically an old field for a couple of years, and some birds find it from somewhere, and you've got some birds hanging around there for a little bit. And so essentially I just think that's just kind of what they were built to do. I mean, they were looking for that next next thing, whether it was a fire or flood or tornado or something, that would just shift that cover back over to what was favorable.
And they know how to find it.
Yeah. I think it's just, and they found that from studies. It's interesting, where you put radio markers on birds and track them, and there's always a certain percentage of them, regardless of how great the habitat is, that are they're gonna disperse and go somewhere else. And again, that kind of goes back to this. That's just their mechanism, for coming and finding new areas.
Rick, if I want to go quail hunting on public land right now, where would you recommend somebody go?
Oh, you would ask me that.
Roy, you gonna make somebody mad picking favorites?
Well, and so we have several different public land options that for folks that are looking to go hunt. And I'm not going to say, keep your expectations in check, I guess, is what I would offer there. We manage most of our state-owned areas, that we kind of have management control over for a variety of species. And so, we don't necessarily focus on quail specifically on any one of them, but there's a few that maybe we do a little bit more quail-friendly types of things, just because of the the habitat type lends itself to that. And so, so we got several areas that Charles Ray Nix Wildlife Management Area up northwest part of the state is one that that we kind of manage with a little bit of an emphasis on quail. And we do have some birds there. It's somewhat difficult to hunt with the terrain and the pretty heavy cover, but it's an interesting area. We've actually got talking about the radio marked birds. We started a radio tagging study up there, and so just kind of looking at the way some of those birds use that area with a sort of a mix of agriculture, upland woods. We haven't done a lot over there in that part of the state, and so as far as some of those specific types of studies, and so that's going to be kind of an interesting one, just seeing what those birds do there. But so that there's some decent cover there, and areas like Copiah County Wildlife Management Area, Marion County Wildlife Management Area are kind of our sort of piney woods types areas, and so we do a lot of prescribed burning and things like that on those. And so there's a few birds that use those. I'm saying a few. I mean, it's some of our better bird numbers, but again, just don't necessarily expect you can just roll out and move 5 coveys necessarily without putting some work in. But there are some birds there. If you want to cover the ground and get some dog work, there's that opportunity on those. And then, of course, some of our national forest lands that still use fire a good bit, especially the DeSoto National Forest. There's lots of acres of open public land associated with our national forests outside of the Delta National Forest. They're not burning out there. So,
Right.
So that one would be an exception, but some of our other national forests offer some opportunities to potentially find quail. And so, in the northeast part of the state, there's areas like Divide Section Wildlife Management Area that's got some kind of grassy types of habitats on it that have some birds as well. So there's some places where you can find birds, but you're gonna have to put in some time. Yeah, find the places to go.
And Chip asked you about public lands, and you've mentioned burning and using fire and prescribed burning now several times. So private land, do you, as the small game coordinator, do you get phone calls for advice, maybe a site visit, and how often is prescribed burning a part of recommendations for landowners? If they say, listen, maybe it's a long shot, but I want to see if we can get quail. I'll have quail. I want a quail hunt. How often is prescribed burning a part of that?
Yeah, that's almost always going to be the first thing I inquire about. Not everybody can do it, and so, but that I do usually pretty quick out of the gate start with kind of what's your view of prescribed fire as far as do you see it fitting into your management regime on your property? Is it something that you might be willing to pay somebody to do, or are you willing to learn to do it to where you might be able to do it yourself? Do you have somebody that could help you? Because it's not something everybody can just go out and do for sure. Mm-hmm. And so we definitely have to temper that. We're not telling anybody just to go out and start throwing matches down or anything like that. It definitely is a prescribed fire, like you say, a tool that you use wisely under certain conditions in a very, very specific way. And so, it's certainly not something that necessarily everybody can do, but it is the primary tool, I guess, or the biggest tool in the toolbox as far as, managing land that's going to be conducive to quail. It's just, you can treat a lot of acres quickly with it, and relatively cost effectively. Now if you're having to pay somebody to do it, it's certainly a cost, but compared to, if you're going to have to go out and do mechanical manipulations with machinery or something like that to get a similar result, you're going to spend a lot too. And so, so all things considered, fire is probably the most efficient tool if we can use it, to manage that habitat. So, like I say, it's definitely not something everybody can do. I get a lot of different responses. When you bring up fire, some people are just can't even think about doing it. Others are curious about doing it, but just don't quite know maybe how to get it done. And then others are,
Yeah.
they're gung ho, they want to do it themselves and that kind of thing. So you get a wide range just based on who it is. But yeah, it's certainly going to be one of the first things we go to.
What is the process then? I'm laying out this hypothetical scenario, but I'm sure it's happened this way some. Maybe it's a landowner, phone call, want quail, what do we do? Then you get down to the topic of prescribed burning. You can do it. It will help. And then let's say someone says, well, I haven't done it. I don't have any experience with it. Then what? Then how do you go about it?
Yeah, and that's kind of the $1 million question there as far as kind of what to do there. So a few things we kind of started trying to do is for those landowners that really have that interest in maybe trying to do it themselves. First thing we're going to recommend is go through the prescribed burn short course that the Mississippi Forestry Commission does.
Right.
Get certified first. That does not necessarily make you a bona fide burn expert, but it's a good start. Getting that base knowledge down. Getting the certification at least gives you some amount of protection when you're doing everything right as far as our law goes, as for the Mississippi Prescribed Burn Act, and then they cover all that in the course. And so, but that would be a good first step, showing you're willing to do that. And then in some cases, we're able to provide some mentorship for some folks. Again, we want to be able to do this on a broader scale. It's right now, it's just kind of still something that we're trying to do where we can. Where we might be able to provide a experienced prescribed burner to go out with somebody that has gotten the certification. They've done what they need to do as far as preparing their fire breaks. Where there's disking up or bulldozing some areas to cut fire off on their property boundaries or burn units. They may have several friends that are willing to be out there to just kind of watch. That's another big component, just having enough people to kind of watch a burn, make sure it's not getting out, having everybody kind of distributed around. And so when they've committed that, we can try to, again, get somebody on the ground with them that has experience to kind of walk them through that process. Sort of, again, kind of being a mentor, almost like a hunting mentor would be, somebody that shows somebody new to hunting, how to hunt.
But as you describe it, though, that's what I'm thinking is what a resource for, someone in the state of Mississippi to be able to pick up the phone and just call you and begin to work through that, as opposed to, just kind of lighting out on their own and sort of becoming self-educated and maybe linking up with the right info. You see, I mean, what of the many, many things that you can point to the department as a state agency as, no, it's not just existing to exist. It's actually existing to actually help people enjoy hunting and fishing. And this is an example of that.
Yeah. And so, of course, again, we'd like to be able to do more of that. And hopefully we'll continue to be able to build that capacity as we go forward. And again, we're always, bringing in new partners on some of this. We've had other organizations that kind of help do some of these same sorts of mission areas. And so yeah, I mean, it's like I say, it's not something we can necessarily always do all the time, but where we can, we try to provide some of that educational opportunity there to get folks to be able to do it for themselves. I mean, certainly folks that can hire somebody to do it for them, I mean, that's great. If you can do that, again, some folks aren't able to do that, or especially folks with smaller acreages, it's difficult sometimes to get somebody, because it's a lot. I understand a contractor to come in, sure, to burn 20 acres. It can be difficult sometimes, when they've got, larger projects that they can get, almost like construction or anything else, it's difficult getting a contractor sometimes. So, sometimes you got to find a way to be able to do that yourself. And so, those especially are some of the ones that we try to kind of bridge that gap a little bit, whereas there's just a barrier for folks that maybe have a smaller property that are willing to kind of get out there, maybe try to get to where they can do that themselves. And, again, just try to get it to where folks can kind of do some of their own management a little better.
And so in focusing on the habitat too for the quail population, for a covey or several covey, what type of acreage are we talking about for it to maybe be really worth the time and the effort to go through all that?
Yeah, because I was just going to I was thinking about that, because isn't the reason why kind of quail habitat has gone down is just because how land's redistributed now, because everyone's on like smaller plots and things like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question there, because that's one that we get a lot. And certain people get a little irritated sometimes when you kind of automatically go to the, well, you got to have a really big acreage. And so I've been a little bit guilty of that in the past, on kind of automatically going to, well, you've got to have really big acreages, and I guess it was my thought process was always going to, or at least early in my career, that people were, their primary interest was hunting quail. And so, there's kind of two different objectives here as far as, as you grow as a professional, learn a little bit to ask a few more questions about, learning what the objective is. And so, there's some landowners that, actually quite a number of landowners that just kind of have that existence value with quail. Just, they're just, I just want to hear them again. I just want to know they're there. I want to keep them there, that kind of thing. I'm not as interested in going out and killing them for, hunting or whatever. You do have some folks that are really, really hardcore, want to harvest quail, and there's nothing wrong with that, but those are two different objectives, kind of, as far as maybe somebody just wants to run a dog a little bit here and there versus somebody that just wants to hunt pretty intensively all season and, have a lot of opportunity to shoot birds. So again, two quite different objectives there. And so for a lot of the folks there that just kind of have that interest in just, I like to know they're there, I want to keep them there kind of thing. You might can do that with 50 or fewer acres, just depending, if you've got some birds in the area, you can make some spots attractive to keep some birds around. You're probably not going to be able to produce a huntable population, on just a smaller acreage. And so that's the situation where you may, you're probably looking at a little bit more of maybe 1,000 or more acres to really keep significant opportunity to be able to hunt birds. Again, you can't just pound them, on an isolated spot there, and have them persist. And so, and of course that's gonna vary a little bit too, just based on, again, where you are in the world. If you're in some of those spots that just still have a little bit more of a quail friendly cover to it, at least, again, you've got a little bit more of that population flow, movement back and forth, versus maybe if you're the only game in town within, 10 miles or so, that population's gonna, be under a lot more pressure as far as, being able to kind of recover from an extreme event or something there. And so it's a hard question to kind of really give a straight answer on, like a lot of things in wildlife management. Sure. But,
because everybody that calls you, every piece of property, they're all different, and what they're in proximity to and what part of the state. So it really is each phone call is different scenario, different solutions for different places. Yeah, it really is. Yeah. That's the frustrating thing for some people. There's, I can't give you a cookbook, can't tear a recipe out. Yeah, and, right. It's every place is different, it's, sure. Yeah, everybody's dealing with something a little different, it's, properties maybe just 10 miles down the road from each other, can be significantly different, just based on kind of what they're dealing with maybe. And, you go to some places that, you've got a lot of invasive vegetation that you got to deal with, and another spot that's maybe, it's just doesn't have much upland cover that you can manage. It's more bottomland or something like that. And so, you're dealing with all these different little limitations and hurdles and different things in a lot of places. But don't necessarily want to discourage anybody from managing quail, based on the size of their place. It's just kind of
you've got to temper your expectations just if you're, based on what your objective is. But
well, and to anyone listening, it does not hurt to pick up the phone and call and talk to you, right?
Yeah. And so in a lot of cases, what we're recommending too is we're going to recommend some of the same things if your interest is deer or turkey or, even a lot of non-game species that require a lot of these same, quail don't live in a vacuum. And so, if you go to the extreme end of managing for quail, then you're probably going to do it at the expense of some other species, but most people are wanting somewhere in the middle. They like deer, they like turkey, they'd be glad to get quail if they could, but,
Sure.
But again, there's some middle ground with a lot of these species that are popular with people. And so a lot of times we're just kind of managed or steering people towards managing, their habitat types based on what kind of fits best with nature. It's the more we try to go against the grain, the harder it is sometimes. And so,
Sure.
If you got pine forest, a lot of times we're going to manage or recommend management practices that are very similar across a lot of these species. And so the, I guess the kind of the positive spin I look at with that more people seem to be embracing habitat management now for deer, turkey, a wider variety of wildlife. And so more people are starting to get interested in prescribed fire, managing their woods for just kind of habitat. And so to me, I think that's kind of one of the brighter spots I see down the road for quail is more people kind of start to embrace that, just managing their property. We'll start to tie together maybe a few more acres that way and start to kind of build that back up and grow out of that island a little bit more,
Sure,
so that's kind of my glass half full, I guess, on that.
That's it. Well, it really is fascinating. It's exciting because as we record, and I know when this probably is published, we're going to be right here on the doorstep of quail season in Mississippi, right around Thanksgiving. So, Rick, appreciate some of your time. And it's really fascinating to hear about it, learn about it. And we'll do this again soon. Thanks for coming by.
Sure thing. Great. I appreciate being here.
He is Rick Hamrick, small game coordinator here at MDWFP. We appreciate you listening. We'll see you outdoors.